Hello, my Stygians. What if I told you that long before YouTube videos, Reddit posts, or blurry photographs made Bigfoot a household name, people were already encountering these creatures? Not just any people, but fur traders risking their lives in uncharted wilderness, British military officers documenting their expeditions, and Native American elders sharing stories passed down through generations. Today, we're going way back, to a time when there were no hoaxes to debunk, no internet fame to chase, and no documentary crews following you around. Just raw, unfiltered testimonies from people who had no reason to lie, and everything to lose by telling these stories. These are the accounts that predate our modern cryptid culture. These are the voices that spoke first. Story 1. Our first stop takes us to 1811, deep in the Pacific Northwest wilderness. The year, Thomas Jefferson is president. The place, near what we call now the Spokane River. And our witness, a man whose very survival depended on accurate observation and detailed record keeping. David Thompson wasn't just any frontiersman. He was a British-Canadian fur trader and explorer whose maps would later help establish the border between the United States and Canada. This was a man who navigated by the stars, who could read weather patterns like a book, who knew the difference between bear tracks and wolf tracks in complete darkness. On a cold winter evening in 1811, Thompson was making camp with his crew near the Spokane River. The snow was deep, the silence absolute, the kind of wilderness silence that city folks can never quite understand. It's not just quiet, it's a living, breathing quiet that makes every sound seem impossibly loud. Thompson wrote in his journal about discovering massive footprints in the snow, but here's what makes his account so compelling. He doesn't just describe what he saw. He describes his process of elimination. Firstly, he considered it being a bear, but the prints were too large, too human-like. The stride was too long, too purposeful. Bears don't walk in straight lines through deep snow unless they're heading somewhere specific. These tracks weren't wandering, they were traveling. Then, he considered Indian snowshoes, but the impressions were too deep, suggesting something far heavier than any human. And there were no accompanying smaller prints, no evidence of the typical traveling party that would venture this far in winter. Thompson's crew grew nervous. These were hardened frontiersmen, men who'd faced down grizzlies and survived brutal winters. But something about these tracks unsettled them in a way that ordinary wildlife never could. The most chilling detail from the Thompson's account: the tracks didn't just cross their path, they seemed to follow it for nearly a mile before veering off toward higher ground, as if something had been watching them, deciding whether they posed a threat. Thompson was a practical man. He didn't speculate wildly in his journals, but he noted that his native guides had a name for whatever these tracks were. They called them the Stick Indians, beings that walked upright like men but belonged deep to the forest. What makes Thompson's testimony so powerful isn't just what he saw, it's what he didn't do. He didn't chase fame or fortune from this story. His journals weren't published until decades later. He was simply recording what he encountered in the wilderness, the same way he recorded river depths and mountain passes. Story 2. From the American frontier, we travel halfway around the world to the roof of the world itself, the Himalayas. The year is 1889, and Queen Victoria sits on the British throne. Our witness this time is Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Austin Waddell, a British Army officer, surgeon, and explore. In 1889, Waddell was leading an expedition through some of the most treacherous terrain on Earth. He and his team were crossing a high mountain pass when they encountered something that would become the first documented Western account of Yeti evidence. In his journal, later published in his book Among the Himalayas in 1900, Waddell wrote about discovering enormous footprints in the snow. But what makes this account remarkable isn't just the physical evidence. It's his methodical approach to documenting it. Waddell measured the prints. He photographed them. He noted the conditions of the snow, the altitude, the weather. This wasn't a panicked scribble in a diary. This was a scientific observation by a trained professional. The footprints were massive, far larger than any human foot. They were deeply impressed in the snow, suggesting a creature of considerable weight, too. But most importantly, they showed a clear bipedal gait with a stride length that would be impossible for any known animal in the region. Here's where the story gets truly fascinating. Waddell's Sherpa guides weren't surprised by the discovery. They had a name for whatever made these tracks. Miche, or hairy wild men. They told Waddell that these beings belonged in the highest peaks, in the eternal snows where no human could survive for long. The Sherpa's reaction is crucial to understanding this testimony. These weren't frightened porters spinning ghost stories around a campfire. These were experienced high-altitude guides whose lives depended on knowing every danger in these mountains. Bears, leopards, wolves, they knew them all, but they spoke to the Miche with a different kind of respect, a recognition of something that didn't fit in their catalog of known dangers. Waddell followed the tracks for over a mile before they disappeared into terrain too dangerous to pursue. In his journal, he noted that the tracks seemed to climb directly up near vertical rock faces that would challenge even experienced mountaineers with modern equipment. What makes Waddell's testimony so compelling is his restraint. He doesn't claim to have seen the creature. He doesn't embellish the story with dramatic encounters. He simply documents what he found and lets the evidence speak for itself. This is the hallmark of credible witness testimony, the acknowledgement of limitations. Waddell's account became the foundation for all subsequent Yeti research. When later expeditions returned with similar evidence, they were following in the footsteps, quite literally, that Waddell first documented in 1889. Story 3. Now we turn to the voices that spoke first, the Native American tribes who lived alongside these creatures for countless generations before European explorers ever set foot in the Americas. In 1865, ethnographer George Gibbs was documenting the languages and traditions of Pacific Northwest tribes when he encountered something unexpected. Tribe after tribe, from different regions and different language families, all had remarkably consistent accounts of the same type of being. The Lumi people called them Semequas, nocturnal giants that stalked the forest. But listen to the specificity of their descriptions. These weren't vague monster stories. The Lumi described creatures that could appear as deer or bears to trick hunters, only revealing their true form when shot with arrows that couldn't penetrate their hide. One elder, recorded by tribal historians, recounted his grandfather's encounter from the 1870s. The grandfather had been fishing at a traditional camp when he discovered massive footprints around their smoke-drying racks. These prints were fresh, made during the night, and showed that something had been investigating their camp while they slept. What struck the elders' grandfather wasn't just the size of the prints, it was their intelligence. The creature had approached from downwind, staying in the shadows of the tree line. It had examined their equipment without disturbing it, as if it understood what it was looking at but chose not to interfere. The Salish people used the word Sasquatch, which would later become Sasquatch. But their descriptions weren't of a mindless monster. They spoke of beings with intelligence, creatures that could make tools, that lived in family groups, that had their own territories and customs. Here's what makes these native testimonies so remarkable. They predate any European influence. These weren't stories contaminated by biblical accounts of giants or European fairy tales about wild men. These were indigenous observations of something that they shared their own territory with. What's fascinating is how these accounts cluster around certain behaviors. Across different tribes, different languages, different regions, these testimonies consistently describe creatures that are primarily nocturnal, beings that avoid direct contact with humans but will investigate human settlements from a distance. Entities that seem to understand human technology but don't use it themselves. Creatures that travel in family groups but are rarely seen together. These seem to be more than just random details of folklore. More like observational patterns of people who encountered something real, something consistent, something that behaved according to its own logic, its own thoughts. The Cherokee had their own account of the Nanyunwi, stone-coated giants. But Cherokee testimonies describe creatures that were protective of the forest, that would drive away hunters who took too much or showed disrespect to the land. One Cherokee account, preserved in tribal oral histories, tells of a hunting party that encountered a family of these beings in the early 1800s. The hunters described watching a large male creature teaching a smaller one, presumably a juvenile, how to build a shelter from fallen branches. The sophistication of the construction, the clear parent-child dynamic, the use of tools. These details paint a picture of intelligence and social structure. Now, when we step back and look at these historical testimonies together, a remarkable pattern emerges. We have a British fur trader in 1811, a British military officer in 1889, and Native American tribes across centuries of oral tradition, all describing encounters with very similar beings. These witnesses came from completely different cultures, different time periods, different continents. They had no way to coordinate their stories, no shared mythology to draw from. Yet their testimonies align in ways that are difficult to dismiss. The physical descriptions are consistent: large, bipedal, covered in hair, with human-like intelligence but animal-like strength. The behavioral patterns match, primarily nocturnal, avoiding direct contact, showing curiosity about human activities, living in family groups. But perhaps the most compelling is what these historical witnesses don't do. They don't sensationalize. They don't claim to have communicated with these beings. They don't weave elaborate narratives about ancient civilizations or supernatural powers. Thompson records tracks and moves on. Waddell documents footprints and continues his expedition. Native elders share observations the same way they describe encounters with bears or wolves, as part of the natural world they lived in. This restraint, this matter-of-fact reporting, is what separates historical testimony from modern cryptid culture. These weren't people seeking attention or trying to sell books. They were people recording what they encountered in their daily lives. The geographic consistency is also striking. These accounts cluster around specific regions: the Pacific Northwest, the Himalayan highlands, the Appalachian Mountains, all areas characterized by dense forest, difficult terrain, and low human population density. What's particularly interesting is how these historical accounts predate the modern mythology we associate with creatures like Bigfoot or the Yeti. The contemporary image of Bigfoot as a gentle giant, a missing link, a guardian of the forest, none of that appears in these early testimonies. Instead, we get more complex, creatures that seem to understand humans but choose to avoid them. Beings that show intelligence and social structure but remain fundamentally something else. Entities that exist at the margins of human experience, neither fully animal nor fully human. These historical voices speak of encounters with something that doesn't fit neatly into our category. These historical voices speak of encounters with something that doesn't fit neatly into our categories. Something that challenges our understanding of what's possible in the natural world. Today, we live in an age of thermal cameras, DNA analysis, and satellite imagery. We've managed to map some of the ocean floor and have even photographed the surface of Mars. Yet these creatures, if they exist, remain as elusive as ever, or perhaps even protected. But these historical testimonies remind us that the question isn't new. People have been encountering something in the world's wild places for centuries. Something that leaves physical evidence but avoids direct contact. Something that seems to understand us better than we understand it. The fur trader, the colonel, the tribal elders. They speak to us across centuries with a consistent message. We are not alone in the wilderness. Something else walks these forests. Something that has learned to live alongside us while remaining largely invisible. Whether these testimonies describe an unknown species, a relic population of early hominids, or something else entirely, they represent some of the most compelling evidence we have. Not because they prove anything definitively, but because they come from people who had no agenda beyond recording what they experienced. In our age of viral videos and social media hoaxes, there's something refreshing about these historical voices. They speak without sensationalism, without the need to go viral, or sell merchandise. They simply say, "This is what I saw. This is what happened. Make of it what you will." Perhaps that's the most important lesson from these historical testimonies. Sometimes the most powerful evidence isn't a clear photograph, or even a DNA sample. Sometimes it's simply the quiet testimony of credible witnesses saying, "I was there, this happened, and I promise you, I'll never forget."